What if the loudest rejection in Hollywood wasn't a public feud, but a silence so deliberate it echoed through West Hollywood? Picture this. December. West Hollywood. Holiday lights strung like secrets across palm-lined streets. Valet lines curling around corners. Invitations guarded like classified documents. Inside, champagne glasses clink. Laughter rises. Music hums low enough to feel exclusive. This isn't just a party. It's a checkpoint. A test. A quiet referendum on who still belongs. And somewhere outside that glow, a name is being whispered, not shouted, not announced. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Whispered. Why? Because in Hollywood, no one wants to be caught saying no out loud anymore. They just don't say anything at all. Now let me ask you something. When someone famous isn't invited to the room where influence is quietly being recalibrated, is that an accident? Or is that the message? This story doesn't begin with a fight. It doesn't begin with a tweet. It doesn't begin with a headline. It begins with discomfort. Subtle, controlled, carefully managed. And at the center of it all are two women whose paths were never supposed to collide like this. Demi Lovato and Meghan Markle. Linked not by friendship, not by collaboration, but by something far more revealing. A closed door. Because according to multiple whispers circulating in entertainment circles, Meghan Markle wanted in. Not to any party, not to just any holiday gathering, but to a very specific, very curated West Hollywood holiday event, one associated with Demi Lovato's inner orbit. And the response? It wasn't rude. It wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was a boundary. A clean, unmistakable, emotionally loaded boundary. And Demi, according to those same whispers, wanted it very clear where she stood. Stay away. Now before you jump to conclusions, let's slow this down. Because this isn't a catfight story. It's not a celebrity feud. It's not about jealousy or competition. It's about access. It's about energy. It's about trust. And in modern Hollywood, trust is more valuable than fame. Ask yourself this. Why would someone with global name recognition struggle to get a holiday party invite? Why would a pop star known for vulnerability, recovery, and fiercely guarded personal space suddenly become the focal point of whispered boundaries? And why is this happening now? Here's where the story really starts to matter. Hollywood has changed. Not publicly, not on red carpets, not in press releases, but privately. Behind the scenes, there's a quiet recalibration happening. Celebrities are drawing lines, tightening circles, protecting spaces that once felt open and communal. And the reason is simple. They're tired. Tired of leaks. Tired of narratives. Tired of being characters in someone else's story. Demi Lovato, in particular, has fought hard for peace, for stability, for safety, emotionally, mentally, spiritually. Her journey has been public, painful, and transformative. And with that journey came a new rule. Access is earned, not assumed. So when word began circulating that Meghan Markle was interested in attending a high-profile, tightly controlled holiday party in West Hollywood, one tied to Demi's extended social circle, it allegedly raised eyebrows. Not because Meghan is unknown, but because she's unpredictable. And unpredictability is Hollywood's biggest fear. Let's be honest for a second. Hollywood doesn't fear scandal anymore. It fears optics. It fears being misinterpreted. It fears losing control of the narrative. It fears waking up to headlines that were never agreed to. And this is where Meghan's reputation, fair or not, quietly enters the room. Because for years now, Meghan has been associated with stories escaping rooms they were never meant to leave. With private conversations becoming public talking points. With carefully framed narratives that leave others scrambling to respond. Again, these are perceptions, whispers, industry gossip. But in Hollywood, perception is reality. So imagine being Demi. You've curated a space meant to feel safe. No phones out. No posturing. No strategic positioning. Just laughter, music, warmth. A moment of normalcy in an industry that rarely offers it. Now imagine hearing that someone wants in, not through a direct invitation, not through friendship, but through indirect channels. Through feelers. Through mutual contacts. Through that uniquely Hollywood dance of just seeing if it might be possible. And suddenly the question isn't, should we invite her? The question becomes, what happens if we do? Because every invite carries risk. Every guest carries energy. And once someone is inside the room, you can't control what happens next. This is where the silence allegedly began. No public rejection, no dramatic refusal, just delay. And delay, in Hollywood, is the language of discomfort. Text messages that go unanswered. Assistants who say they'll circle back. Managers who suddenly become hard to reach. And according to those close to the situation, Demi's stance was quietly communicated. She didn't want the complication. She didn't want the speculation. She didn't want the possibility of her private space becoming someone else's narrative moment. So she drew a line. Now let me ask you this. Is that cruelty? Or is that self-protection? Because here's the uncomfortable truth no one likes to say out loud. Being famous doesn't mean being trusted. And being royal adjacent doesn't mean being welcome in Hollywood's most intimate rooms. Especially not now. Especially not in a town where people have learned the hard way that proximity can be dangerous. What makes this story resonate isn't just the alleged rejection. It's the way it happened. Quietly. Decisively. Without explanation. And that's what makes it sting. Because there's no one to argue with. No headline to rebut. No statement to correct. Just absence. And absence is brutal. Sources claim that Meghan's interest in attending wasn't framed as entitlement, at least not outwardly. It was framed as connection, as rebuilding, as re-entering a world she once brushed against but never fully claimed. But rebuilding requires permission. And permission, in this case, wasn't granted. What's fascinating is how many people allegedly supported Demi's decision behind the scenes. Not loudly, not publicly, but with knowing nods. Because many in Hollywood have reached the same conclusion. Protect your peace. Guard your space. Choose silence over chaos. This wasn't about Demi versus Meghan. It was about control versus uncertainty. And if you're wondering why this story matters now, look around. More celebrities are shrinking their circles. More parties are becoming invite-only within invite-only. More doors are closing, not with a slam, but with a soft click. And those clicks are being heard. Especially by those who once assumed access was automatic. Which brings us back to that holiday night. Music playing. Laughter spilling into the street. A room full of people who feel chosen. And someone on the outside, realizing too late that silence was the answer. Because according to whispers, this wasn't the end of the attempt. It was only the first signal. Hollywood doesn't slam doors anymore. It lets them close slowly. So slowly that by the time you realize you're locked out, everyone inside has already moved on. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the heart of this story. And it's where chapter 1 truly begins. Because once the silence set in, once the invitation didn't arrive, the question quietly shifted from, will she be invited? To something far more revealing. Why wasn't she? And in Hollywood, that question never stays innocent for long. Let's talk about how exclusion really works now. Not the dramatic, tabloid-friendly kind. Not the you're canceled spectacle. But the kind that happens in text threads you'll never see. In guest lists you'll never read. In conversations that stop mid-sentence when a certain name is mentioned. This is the era of soft power. And Meghan Markle, according to multiple industry whispers, may have just collided with it head-on. Here's something most people don't understand about celebrity culture. The real hierarchy isn't built on fame anymore. It's built on safety. Who feels safe to be around? Who won't complicate the room? Who won't turn a private moment into a public talking point? That's the currency now. And holiday parties, especially in West Hollywood, are where that currency gets tested. Because these aren't just parties. They're audits. Every guest list answers one unspoken question. Who do we trust enough to let inside? And this particular holiday party, tied loosely but unmistakably to Demi Lovato's inner social orbit, wasn't designed to be flashy. It wasn't about photos. It wasn't about visibility. It was about comfort. And comfort, in Hollywood, is fragile. So when a name like Meghan Markle reportedly surfaced as someone interested in attending, it triggered something subtle but immediate. A pause. A recalibration. Not because Meghan lacks fame. She doesn't. Not because she lacks relevance. That's debatable, but not the point. But because she brings something else into a room. Narrative gravity. Think about it. When Meghan enters a space, conversations shift. People become careful. Memories get selective. Words get weighed. Everyone becomes aware that what they say might matter later. Not in the moment, but in retrospect. And that awareness kills intimacy. That's the part no one wants to say out loud. So instead, they say nothing. Now here's where it gets interesting. According to those familiar with how these invitations are handled, Meghan didn't knock on the door herself. Not directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, the interest allegedly traveled the way most Hollywood requests do. Through intermediaries, mutual contacts, industry acquaintances, people who could casually float the idea without committing anyone to an answer. That's how you test a room. And the room didn't respond. No enthusiastic yes. No polite decline. Just a kind of collective stillness. And stillness, in this town, is not neutral. Stillness is strategy. Because saying no creates friction. Silence creates distance. And distance is safer. What's critical to understand here is that Demi Lovato didn't need to make an announcement. She didn't need to issue a statement. She didn't need to explain herself to anyone. Her boundary was communicated through absence. And according to multiple accounts, it was intentional. Demi's world right now is tightly controlled by necessity. She's spoken openly about protecting her mental health, her sobriety, her emotional equilibrium. That means fewer people, fewer variables, less unpredictability. So when word reached her orbit that Meghan's attendance was being explored, it reportedly raised immediate red flags. Not alarms. Red flags. The kind you don't ignore if you've been burned before. And here's the contradiction that makes this story so compelling. Publicly, Hollywood champions inclusivity. Privately, it practices extreme selectivity. You're welcome everywhere, until you're not. And the moment you're not, no one explains why. This is where the emotional undertone shifts. Because exclusion doesn't just sting, it confuses. Imagine being someone who's used to doors opening, to rooms rearranging themselves around your presence, to invitations appearing simply because of who you are. Now imagine that stopping. Not loudly, not angrily, just quietly. That kind of rejection messes with your head. And sources suggest that behind the scenes, Meghan's camp noticed the shift almost immediately. The enthusiasm that wasn't there. The warmth that didn't materialize. The vague responses that never turned into plans. And here's the thing. In Hollywood, one missed invitation can be dismissed. Two can be coincidence. Three becomes a pattern. And this wasn't happening in isolation. Around the same time, whispers began circulating that several social circles were tightening. Not just Demi's. Others too. Different hosts. Different events. Same result. No invite. And suddenly, the story wasn't about Demi anymore. It was about something bigger. A silent re-ranking. Because Hollywood doesn't exile you all at once. It slowly forgets you. And forgetting is brutal. Now let's talk about Demi's role again. Because it's important to be fair. Nothing suggests malice. Nothing suggests hostility. Nothing suggests personal dislike. In fact, people close to Demi describe her response as calm, measured, and rooted entirely in self-protection. She didn't want the complication. She didn't want the speculation. She didn't want to wake up the next morning wondering how a private moment might be interpreted elsewhere. And that fear isn't paranoia. It's learned behavior. Hollywood has seen too many private rooms become public battlegrounds. So Demi did what many are now doing. She chose peace. And peace, in this case, meant exclusion. What makes this moment so revealing is how many people quietly understood. No one pushed back. No one challenged the decision. No one insisted on inclusion for inclusion's sake. If anything, there was relief. Because everyone knew what the presence of a certain guest might change. The tone, the conversations, the safety. And that's when it became clear. This wasn't a snub. It was a signal. A signal that access in Hollywood now comes with conditions. And one of those conditions is trust. But here's where the story takes its first sharp turn. Because silence doesn't always end the conversation. Sometimes, it invites another approach. And according to whispers that would later circulate far beyond West Hollywood, Meghan didn't stop at the first non-response. There was another route. Another intermediary. Another attempt to soften the boundary. And that second attempt, the one meant to smooth things over, may have done the exact opposite. Because when boundaries are tested, they tend to harden. And what allegedly happened next didn't just confirm Demi's decision. It solidified it. In a way that made turning back impossible. What happens when silence doesn't work? What happens when the first quiet no isn't accepted and someone tries another door? Because that's where this story deepens. And that's where things allegedly went from awkward to irreversible. Hollywood has a saying that never makes it into interviews. If the first door doesn't open, you don't knock louder. You find someone else who has a key. And according to multiple whispers circulating in entertainment circles, that's exactly what happened next. Because after the initial non-response, the unanswered messages, the vague delays, the polite nothingness, the situation didn't simply fade away. It shifted. The approach changed. And this second approach is what reportedly confirmed, once and for all, that Demi Lovato's boundary wasn't just a momentary hesitation. It was a line in the sand. Let's talk about intermediaries. Because in Hollywood, very little happens directly. Celebrities rarely say, "I want to come." They say, "Someone I know is curious." They rarely hear, "No." They hear, "It might be complicated." This language exists for a reason. It allows everyone to save face. But it also creates danger. Because when you bring a third party into a situation, you lose control of tone, of nuance, of intent. And that's exactly what allegedly happened here. After the first feelers went unanswered, sources claim that a different intermediary entered the picture, someone with broader social overlap, someone perceived as neutral, someone who believed they could smooth things out, someone who thought this was just a misunderstanding. And here's where you need to pause. Because this wasn't framed as pressure. It wasn't framed as entitlement. It was framed as reassurance. The message, allegedly, was subtle but clear. There's no agenda. There's no press angle. There's no ulterior motive. Just holiday spirit. Just connection. Just inclusion. On the surface, that sounds harmless. Even reasonable. So why did it backfire? Because when someone has already chosen silence, a second approach doesn't feel like clarification. It feels like testing. And Demi, according to those close to her orbit, noticed immediately. Here's something people don't realize about boundaries. They aren't just about what you say yes to. They're about what you refuse to negotiate. And the moment a boundary has to be re-explained, it stops being respected. This is where the emotional temperature changed. What had been a quiet decision became a conscious one. What had been passive became active. And Demi's response, or lack of one, allegedly became firmer. No follow-up. No reassurance. No alternate plans. Just a closed loop. And for those watching closely, that was the answer. But let's look at this from the other side for a moment. Because it's easy to frame this as exclusion and stop there. But imagine being Meghan. You've relocated. You've distanced yourself from one world. You're trying to re-anchor in another. Hollywood, at least on paper, should be familiar territory. You've attended events. You've had connections. You've brushed shoulders with influence. So when invitations stop coming, not just from one event, but from multiple spaces, the instinct isn't always to retreat. It's to re-engage, to clarify, to fix what feels like a misunderstanding. And that instinct makes sense. But Hollywood doesn't reward persistence. It rewards intuition. And this is where the misalignment may have happened. Because while Meghan's camp allegedly saw the second approach as harmless, Demi's side reportedly experienced it differently. As pressure. Not aggressive pressure, not rude pressure, but social pressure. The kind that says, "Are you sure?" The kind that forces someone to justify their no. And Demi didn't want to justify anything. She wanted to protect her space. And the more that space felt examined, the less appealing it became to open it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When someone asks twice to be included, the room starts to wonder why. And that curiosity isn't kind. Questions start forming. Why does this matter so much? What's the urgency? What's at stake? And suddenly, the original concern, unpredictability, feels validated. This is where the contradiction deepens. Because the attempt to reassure allegedly did the opposite. It highlighted the very tension everyone wanted to avoid. According to whispers, Demi's team became even more cautious after the second outreach. Not alarmed. Cautious. And caution in Hollywood is decisive. Because once a host starts imagining worst-case scenarios, the guest list doesn't expand. It shrinks. What if someone overhears something? What if something gets misinterpreted? What if the presence alone changes the energy? These questions don't need answers. They just need to exist. And once they exist, the invitation is gone. What's fascinating is how quietly everyone around Demi accepted this. No one argued for inclusion. No one pushed back. No one framed it as unfair. Instead, the consensus, allegedly, was simple. It's her space. It's her night. It's her call. And that consensus tells you everything you need to know about Hollywood right now. Because 10 years ago, refusing someone with Meghan's profile would have been unthinkable. Now, it's almost expected, not because of who she is, but because of what she represents. A narrative. And Hollywood is exhausted by narratives. They want moments without meaning, laughter without subtext, conversations that don't come back to haunt them. That's why this second attempt mattered so much. Because it crossed the invisible line between curiosity and insistence. And once that line is crossed, there's no walking it back. Silence becomes policy. And according to sources, that silence wasn't limited to Demi. It rippled. Other hosts took note. Other circles recalibrated. Other invitations quietly disappeared before they were ever drafted. Not because anyone was coordinating, but because Hollywood is a small town that runs on instinct. And instincts spread fast. Now here's the part that makes this chapter emotionally heavy. Because no one officially rejected Meghan. No one told her she wasn't welcome. No one offered an explanation. And that ambiguity is cruel. Because you can't respond to it. You can't defend yourself against silence. You can't correct a vibe. You can only feel it. And according to whispers, that feeling didn't go unnoticed. Frustration began to surface behind the scenes. Not publicly, not explosively, but privately. Questions about why doors felt harder to open. Questions about who was influencing these decisions. Questions about whether something had shifted permanently. And here's where this story starts turning from social awkwardness into something much bigger. Because when someone feels excluded from a system they once assumed they belonged to, they don't just feel rejected. They feel destabilized. And destabilization changes behavior. It makes people reassess alliances, reconsider strategies, rethink next moves. Which brings us to the next turning point. Because while Demi's boundary held firm, something else was happening quietly in the background. A conversation. Not with Demi, not with the host, but with someone else entirely. Someone whose opinion carried weight. Someone whose reaction would confirm whether this exclusion was isolated or systemic. And once that conversation happened, once that reaction became clear, it reportedly confirmed a truth that couldn't be ignored anymore. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a message, and that message was spreading. But who was that person? And what did they say that made it clear the door wasn't just closed, but locked? That's where Chapter 2 ends. Demi Lovato didn't fight this hard for her life just to hand her peace over to someone else's uncertainty. That's the part of this story most people miss. They hear holiday party. They hear celebrity exclusion. They hear West Hollywood drama. And they assume ego. It's about survival. Because if you really understand Demi Lovato's journey, not the headlines, not the sound bites, but the lived reality, then her response in this situation stops looking cold and starts looking inevitable. Let me ask you something. If you had nearly lost everything, your health, your stability, your sense of self, would you gamble that hard-won peace on one unpredictable variable? Would you invite chaos back into your life just to appear polite? Or would you protect your space at all costs? With context, because Demi's boundary didn't come out of nowhere. It came from experience. Painful, public, relentless experience. For years, Demi's life played out under a microscope. Every relapse speculated on. Every lyric dissected. Every friendship analyzed for symbolism. She became, at times, less of a person and more of a cautionary tale that the industry consumed in pieces. And when you survive that kind of exposure, something changes. You stop craving access. You stop chasing validation. You start choosing silence. Demi has talked openly about rebuilding her life brick by brick. About learning to say no without explanation. About prioritizing safety, emotional, mental, physical, above optics. And here's the key point. Those boundaries aren't theoretical. They're practiced. So when the idea of Meghan Markle entering her social orbit surfaced, not directly, not warmly, but as a possibility, it wasn't evaluated like a normal guest request. It was filtered through instinct. And instinct doesn't negotiate. People close to Demi have described her current mindset in very similar terms. No drama. No mess. No surprises. If something even hints at destabilizing energy, it's out. No discussion required. And that's where this situation became less about Meghan specifically and more about what she represents. Because whether fair or unfair, Meghan carries narrative weight. Every interaction involving her is interpreted. Every presence analyzed. Every silence scrutinized. And Demi didn't want her space to become a subplot in someone else's story. Imagine hosting a holiday party where the entire goal is warmth, ease, grounding, and knowing that one guest's presence might shift the room into caution mode. People watching what they say, people guarding their tone, people wondering what could be repeated later. That's not a party. That's a performance. And Demi is done performing. This is the contradiction that defines her era. She's a celebrity who no longer wants celebrity dynamics inside her private life. And that means saying no to people who might once have seemed untouchable. Now here's where the story deepens. Because according to those familiar with the internal discussion, Demi didn't just react emotionally. She asked questions. Quiet ones. Simple ones. The kind that reveal everything. What's the upside? What's the risk? What changes if this person walks into the room? And those questions reportedly didn't produce reassuring answers. Not because Meghan is malicious. Not because she's dangerous. But because she's complicated. And Demi doesn't do complicated anymore. What makes this moment so revealing is how unemotional the decision allegedly was. No anger. No judgment. No gossip. Just a calm assessment. Does this serve my peace? And the answer was no. Now let's pause and flip perspectives again. Because while Demi was protecting her space, Meghan was likely interpreting silence through an entirely different lens. From Meghan's side, this may not have felt like a boundary. It may have felt like confusion, like mixed signals, like an industry that once flirted with her presence suddenly cooling off without explanation. And that's where emotional friction begins. Because boundaries feel clean to the person setting them, but they feel arbitrary to the person encountering them. And when those boundaries aren't articulated, they sting even more. This is where Hollywood's cruelty shows up, not in rejection, but in ambiguity. Demi didn't owe anyone an explanation, but the lack of one created a vacuum, and vacuums get filled with speculation. Is it personal? Is it political? Is it influenced by someone else? And those questions allegedly started circulating quietly, not loudly enough to reach the press, but loudly enough to reach ears. And here's the uncomfortable part. The more those questions circulated, the more Demi's original instinct felt validated. Because speculation is exactly what she was trying to avoid. Now think about this. If the mere absence of an invitation can create this much internal noise, what would the presence have done? That's the logic that reportedly solidified Demi's stance. No invitation meant no aftermath, and no aftermath meant peace. This is also where Hollywood's gender dynamics come into play. Because when women draw boundaries, they're often labeled difficult, cold, exclusive, unfriendly. But when Demi draws a boundary, those close to her don't see hostility. They see self-respect, and they respect it. That's another critical detail. No one in Demi's circle pushed back. No one insisted she reconsider. No one framed it as the right thing to do. They trusted her judgment. Which tells you something about how strong that judgment has become, and how aware everyone is of the risks. What's fascinating is that Demi and Meghan aren't rivals. They don't compete professionally. They don't share industries. They don't share audiences. Their worlds overlap only in one place: Hollywood's private rooms. And those rooms operate on rules the public never sees. Rules about discretion, about predictability, about energy. Demi passed those tests by withdrawing. Meghan, according to whispers, may have failed simply by triggering concern. Again, not wrongdoing. Concern. And concern is enough. Now here's where this chapter pivots towards something even more telling. Because while Demi was holding firm, she wasn't acting in a vacuum. Other voices were being consulted, not to decide for her, but to confirm instinct. And one question, reportedly raised during a private conversation, cut straight to the heart of the matter. Has anyone ever regretted letting her in? That question didn't require a spoken answer. The pause said enough. Because in Hollywood, pauses are confessions. And once that pause existed, the decision was sealed. This wasn't about denying Meghan access. It was about denying risk. And that's a distinction that changes everything. Demi didn't tell Meghan to stay away publicly. She didn't need to. The boundary spoke for itself. And as quietly as it was drawn, it was absolute. But this chapter doesn't end with Demi. Because while Demi was protecting her peace, someone else was watching closely. Someone who had seen this pattern before. Someone who understood what quiet exclusion really means. Someone whose reaction would confirm whether this was just one party, or the beginning of something far bigger. And once that person weighed in, once their stance became clear, the implications of Demi's decision rippled far beyond West Hollywood. Because when one person draws a boundary, others feel empowered to do the same. And that's when silence becomes contagious. But who was that person? And why did their response quietly signal that Meghan's problem wasn't one host, but an entire system recalibrating around her? That's where this story turns from personal to systemic. What makes someone unsafe in Hollywood isn't always scandal. Sometimes it's unpredictability. That's where Chapter 4 begins. Not with accusations, not with receipts, but with a fear that never shows up on camera and never needs proof to be powerful. Because Hollywood doesn't operate on facts alone. It operates on anticipation. Ask yourself this. Why do certain names make rooms go quiet? Why do conversations change direction mid-sentence? Why do people lower their voices when someone's reputation enters the air, even if that person hasn't? The answer isn't always guilt. It's risk. And according to industry whispers, risk was the word quietly circling this situation. Not in emails, not in group chats, but in glances, in pauses, in the subtle tightening of expressions when the idea of Meghan Markle's presence came up. Here's the uncomfortable truth no one says publicly. Hollywood doesn't fear bad people. It fears uncontrollable stories. And Meghan, fairly or unfairly, has come to represent a story that never stays contained. That perception didn't start with Demi. And it didn't end with her either. It existed long before this holiday party ever took shape. Which is why Demi's decision, allegedly rooted in instinct, didn't feel isolated to those watching closely. It felt familiar. This chapter is about how reputations evolve in private, long before they collapse in public. Because public narratives lag behind private consensus. Always. In the months leading up to that West Hollywood holiday season, there was already a noticeable shift happening behind the scenes. Not dramatic, not coordinated, but unmistakable. Fewer casual invitations. More let's keep it small. More emphasis on trusted circles. And when people started quietly asking, why? The answers were never explicit. They didn't have to be. She brings attention. She changes the energy. It becomes about her. None of those statements accuse wrongdoing. But all of them signal discomfort. And discomfort is enough to redraw social maps. This is where Hollywood's greatest contradiction reveals itself. It celebrates authenticity publicly, but craves predictability privately. Demi Lovato's world right now thrives on predictability, routine, boundaries, consistency. So when people around her allegedly began raising concerns, not warnings, not objections, but considerations, they weren't being dramatic. They were being protective. Because once you've rebuilt your life from the ground up, you don't invite unknown variables into your foundation. And Meghan, despite her fame, has become an unknown variable in Hollywood's private rooms. That's not an insult. It's a classification, a sign that people don't know how to contextualize her presence anymore. Is she a guest? A symbol? A story in progress? Those questions matter. Because every room has a purpose. And this holiday party's purpose was simple. Peace. Let's talk about what allegedly came up in those private discussions. Not quotes, not transcripts, but themes. The first theme was optics. Not public optics. Internal optics. What does it look like to have her here? What does it signal to others? What does it change about the night? Because in Hollywood, guests don't just attend events. They define them. And Demi didn't want her night defined by anything other than warmth. The second theme was privacy. Again, not accusations, concerns. Not about intent, but about outcome. Would people feel comfortable opening up? Would conversations remain private? Would everyone feel at ease being fully themselves? These are questions hosts ask quietly and answer decisively. The third theme was aftermath. Because Hollywood has learned that the real consequences don't happen during the party. They happen after. In the retelling. In the interpretations. In the way moments get reframed. And Demi, by all accounts, didn't want to think about any of that. She wanted a night that ended when the lights went off, not one that lingered. Now here's where this chapter sharpens. Because according to whispers, one comparison came up, not as a criticism, but as a cautionary tale. A story of another celebrity who once seemed welcome everywhere, until suddenly they weren't. Not because they did something unforgivable, but because people started feeling watched. And once people feel watched, they stop relaxing. They stop laughing freely. They stop sharing honestly. They stop showing up. And that's death to intimacy. Demi's circle values intimacy above all else. And they protect it ruthlessly. What's telling is how little debate there reportedly was once these concerns surfaced. No one argued that Meghan deserved an invite. No one framed it as an obligation. Because in Hollywood's private code, invitations aren't earned by status. They're earned by trust. And trust, once questioned, is rarely restored quickly. Now consider the emotional contradiction again. Meghan's public narrative often centers around exclusion, around being shut out, around not being welcomed. But in Hollywood's private interpretation, that narrative itself becomes part of the discomfort. Because hosts don't want to risk becoming characters in someone else's story. They don't want to wonder if a night meant to be joyful might later be framed as symbolic. And that fear, again, fair or unfair, carries weight. So when Demi allegedly asked the question, "Will this change the room?" the answer wasn't reassuring. And that answer didn't need to be spoken. It lived in the silence. This is also where another layer emerges. Because Demi isn't alone in this thinking. She's part of a generation of celebrities who've watched friendships implode over narratives, alliances dissolve over misunderstandings, and private moments weaponized unintentionally. And they've learned. Better to exclude quietly than regret loudly. Better to protect your peace than repair damage. That's not cruelty. That's adaptation. Now imagine being Meghan on the other side of this equation. You're not being told no. You're not being confronted. You're being avoided. And avoidance feels personal even when it isn't. Because there's no closure, no explanation, just distance. And distance breeds stories, which only reinforces the cycle. This is where Hollywood's system becomes self-fulfilling. The fear of narrative creates distance. Distance creates speculation. Speculation validates fear. And round it goes. Demi's decision, in that context, wasn't about Meghan alone. It was about opting out of the cycle entirely. And that's why this moment matters. Because it reveals how power now operates. Not through declarations, not through dominance, but through selective access. Demi didn't say stay away publicly. But in Hollywood, not extending an invitation says exactly that. Quietly, firmly, and with consequences. Because once one person draws that line, others notice. They ask themselves the same questions. Will this change my space? Will this complicate my night? Will this invite something I can't control? And when the answers feel uncertain, the default becomes no. Not spoken, just practiced. This is the moment where the story begins to tip from individual choice into collective behavior. Because Demi's boundary didn't exist in isolation. It reflected a larger mood, a tightening, a recalibration. And according to whispers, one particularly influential voice, someone known for being brutally honest in private, summed it up in a single sentence during a separate conversation. She's not unsafe. She's just unpredictable. That sentence didn't need elaboration. Because unpredictability is Hollywood's red flag. Not because it implies wrongdoing, but because it implies loss of control. And control is the one thing Hollywood values above all else. So Demi's decision held. And the party went on. Laughter, music, warmth. No drama. No headlines. Just a room full of people who felt safe enough to exhale. And somewhere else, someone felt the absence. But this chapter doesn't end with Demi's fear or Hollywood's caution. It ends with a realization. Because once the idea of risk attached itself to a name, even softly, it didn't stay confined to one event. It traveled, quietly, from host to host, from circle to circle, and the next place it showed up was somewhere Meghan didn't expect. Because the next door that quietly closed wasn't social. It was strategic. And when that door closed, the implications went far beyond a holiday party. They touched relevance. They touched access. They touched power. And once you understand which door that was, you'll understand why this wasn't just a moment of exclusion. It was a turning point. But that's where Chapter 4 ends. Because to understand what happened next and why it mattered so much, we need to talk about control. Who has it? Who lost it? And who is quietly reclaiming it behind the scenes? And that's where Chapter 5 begins. Go. This wasn't about dislike. It was about control. And that distinction changes everything. Because once you understand that, Chapter 5 stops being a gossip story and starts looking like a case study in how power actually works in Hollywood now. Not loudly, not publicly, Not with press releases or statements, but quietly, decisively, behind closed doors. Let's strip this down. For decades, celebrity power meant visibility. Who got photographed? Who got invited? Who was talked about? But that era is fading. The new power is something else entirely. It's the power to curate silence. And Demi Lovato, whether intentionally or instinctively, exercised that power perfectly. Here's the uncomfortable truth. In Hollywood, the most influential people aren't always the loudest ones. They're the ones who don't need to explain themselves. And Demi didn't. She didn't justify. She didn't clarify. She didn't defend. She simply chose. And that choice carried weight because of one crucial thing. People trusted her judgment. That's the part that doesn't show up in headlines. Trust is currency now. And Demi has it. Not because she's perfect. Not because she's powerful. But because she's predictable in the one way Hollywood values most. Her boundaries are real. She doesn't say yes lightly. And when she says no, she means it. That kind of clarity makes people feel safe. So when Demi's decision became known, not announced, not explained, but understood, it didn't spark debate. It sparked alignment. Other people quietly thought, that makes sense. And once that happens, control shifts. Because Hollywood doesn't move by consensus meetings. It moves by mood. And the mood, increasingly, is protective. Let's talk about what control actually looked like in this situation. It wasn't Demi saying, you can't come. It was Demi deciding what her space would be and refusing to let anything redefine it. That's power. Because once you define your space clearly, anyone who doesn't fit simply doesn't enter. No confrontation required. Now here's where the dynamic flips. Because while Demi was exercising control by limiting access, Meghan's position was changing in the opposite direction. Not in terms of fame, but in terms of leverage. Hollywood is ruthless about this. The moment you start needing access, you've already lost some of it. And according to whispers, that's what began to concern people behind the scenes. Not that Meghan wanted to attend a party, but that she wanted to attend that party. Because wanting implies value, and value implies scarcity, and scarcity changes perception. Think about it. If you're invited everywhere, you don't notice exclusions. But if invitations start drying up, every closed door becomes louder. And that's when behavior shifts. Not dramatically, subtly. More outreach, more checking in, more just seeing if. And in Hollywood, that shift is noticed. Because neediness, even social neediness, makes people uncomfortable. It creates imbalance. And imbalance erodes control. This is where the story becomes less about Meghan as a person and more about Meghan as a symbol. A symbol of someone trying to reassert relevance in a system that quietly moved on. Again, not malicious, but revealing. Because Hollywood doesn't wait. It recalibrates constantly. And if you step out of alignment for too long, re-entry becomes harder. Not impossible, but harder. Now here's the key contradiction. Meghan still has visibility. She still has headlines. She still has a platform. But visibility is no longer enough. Because Hollywood's real power brokers don't live in public spaces anymore. They live in private rooms. And access to those rooms is tightly controlled. Demi understands that. She doesn't chase relevance. She protects intimacy. And intimacy is where real influence happens. So when Demi chose not to include Meghan, she wasn't rejecting her. She was preserving control. Control over the tone. Control over the energy. Control over the aftermath. And everyone watching understood that instinctively. Now let's talk about the emotional undercurrent. Because control isn't cold. It's often rooted in fear. Fear of losing peace. Fear of chaos creeping back in. Fear of reliving old patterns. Demi's past has taught her one brutal lesson. You don't get second chances at stability. You guard it. And that makes her decisions sharp. Non-negotiable. So when the second approach happened, the alternate route, the attempt to reassure, it didn't soften her stance. It hardened it. Because reassurance implies doubt. And Demi wasn't doubting herself. She trusted her instinct. Which meant any attempt to override it felt like intrusion. And intrusion is the one thing she doesn't tolerate anymore. Now let's zoom out. Because Demi wasn't the only one thinking this way. Across Hollywood, a quiet shift has been happening. Celebrities are pulling back. Fewer big parties. More small dinners. More invite-only gatherings where everyone knows everyone. This isn't coincidence. It's response. Response to leaks. Response to narratives. responds to the feeling that nothing stays private anymore. And Meghan, again fairly or unfairly, has become associated with that fear. Not because she's dangerous, but because she's visible in ways that feel uncontrollable. That's why control mattered so much in this story. Because Demi wasn't just choosing who attended her party. She was choosing what kind of Hollywood she wanted to exist in. One where private moments stay private. One where guests don't wonder how a night will be interpreted later. One where safety isn't performative. And that choice resonated. Now here's where things quietly escalated. Because once Demi exercised control, and did so without backlash, it sent a message. A powerful one. You can say no. You can choose your space. You don't owe access to anyone. And when one respected figure demonstrates that, others follow. Not out of malice. Out of permission. This is where Meghan's challenge deepened. Because it wasn't just Demi's party anymore. It was a pattern forming. And patterns in Hollywood are devastating. They're invisible until they're undeniable. Suddenly, it's not about one event. It's about momentum. And momentum, once lost, is hard to regain. Now imagine being on the outside of that shift. Not being told explicitly what changed. Not being informed of any mistake. Just sensing that rooms feel colder. That calls aren't returned as quickly. That enthusiasm has dulled. That's destabilizing. And destabilization pushes people to seek clarity. To ask questions. To look for allies. Which brings us to the moment that changed the tone entirely. Because while Demi was exerting control quietly, Meghan was reportedly seeking confirmation elsewhere. Not from Demi. From someone whose opinion mattered even more. Someone whose reaction would answer the unspoken question. Is this just one person's boundary? Or is this the industry's verdict? And when that person's response became known, subtle, indirect, but unmistakable, it confirmed something Meghan may not have been ready to face. This wasn't personal. It was structural. And once a structure shifts, individual effort can't reverse it. That's where this chapter ends. Because the next chapter isn't about parties or invitations. It's about what happens when someone realizes they're no longer operating from a position of control and starts trying to regain it. And when that realization sets in, the moves that follow become far more strategic and far more risky. Because when control slips, people act. And what Meghan allegedly did next, who she reached out to, and why, would signal to Hollywood that this wasn't just about a holiday party anymore. It was about relevance. And once relevance becomes the goal, every move is scrutinized. When no invitation comes, the message is already delivered. That's the cruel genius of modern Hollywood. Because no one has to say anything. No one has to explain. No one has to take responsibility. The absence does all the work. And this is where Chapter 6 begins, at the moment when silence stopped being ambiguous and started feeling intentional. By now, according to whispers, the pattern was hard to ignore. It wasn't just Demi's party. It wasn't just one social circle. It wasn't just one awkward non-response. It was repetition. And repetition changes how silence feels. The first time, you rationalize it. The second time, you question timing. The third time, you start asking different questions. Not what went wrong, but what changed. This is the point where exclusion becomes personal, even if it was never intended to be. Because Hollywood trains you to equate invitations with value. And when those invitations quietly evaporate, the loss isn't just social. It's psychological. Let's slow this moment down. Imagine watching December unfold on social media. Photos from intimate gatherings. Stories tagged at candlelit dinners. Laughter captured in private-looking spaces. Not flashy premieres. Not red carpets. The rooms that matter. And your name isn't in any of them. Not because you were told no, but because you weren't asked. That's when the message lands. And according to those familiar with the situation, this is where frustration began to surface behind the scenes. Not publicly, not angrily, but internally. Because silence doesn't just hurt, it destabilizes. It creates a vacuum where confidence used to live. And vacuums demand answers. Now here's where this chapter gets uncomfortable. Because when someone starts feeling excluded, their instinct is rarely to withdraw. It's to reassert presence. To remind people they're still here. Still relevant. Still connected. And that instinct, while human, can backfire in Hollywood. Because reassertion looks like effort. And effort looks like need. And need makes people nervous. This is where the contradiction deepens. Meghan still had visibility. She still had headlines. She still had global recognition. But visibility doesn't guarantee access. In fact, sometimes it works against it. Because high visibility raises the stakes. Every interaction becomes heavier. Every appearance more symbolic. And hosts who just want ease opt out. This is reportedly where Meghan's camp began reframing the situation internally. Not as rejection, but as misunderstanding. Because misunderstanding can be fixed. Rejection can't. So the narrative shifted. Maybe people think she's too busy. Maybe they assume she wouldn't want to come. Maybe there's confusion about availability. These explanations feel better. They preserve dignity. But they also delay acceptance. And Hollywood punishes delay. Because while someone is trying to understand what's happening, the industry has already moved on. Now let's talk about the quiet ripple effect. Because exclusion isn't isolated. When one host doesn't invite you, others notice. Not consciously. Not maliciously. But socially. They think, oh, she wasn't there. They wonder, is she around? And those tiny questions accumulate. This is how social capital erodes. Not through scandal. Through absence. And absence, once noticed, becomes self-reinforcing. Because people take cues from each other. If someone respected draws a boundary, others feel safer drawing their own. Not because they dislike you, but because they don't want to be the exception. And that's where this chapter shifts from emotional to strategic. Because once Meghan's team reportedly realized this wasn't a one-off, the question became urgent. How do you interrupt a silent pattern? You can't respond to silence directly. You have to create noise. But not just any noise. The right kind. And this is where the line between organic presence and strategic positioning starts to blur. Because in Hollywood, timing is everything. In December, the holiday season, isn't just about celebration. It's about visibility resets. Who's seen where? Who's included in what? Who's photographed with whom? And missing that window matters. So according to whispers, there was a push to remind the industry that Meghan still belonged in these conversations. Not by forcing invitations, but by signaling relevance elsewhere. Appearances, alignments, conversations. The idea wasn't to chase Demi's party. That door was closed. The idea was to show that other doors were still open. But here's where the plan ran into friction. Because the industry wasn't just watching what Meghan did. It was watching how she did it. And how it felt. And something about it, subtle, intangible, didn't land the way it once might have. Because when someone is truly in demand, their presence feels effortless. When they're not, it feels curated. And curated feels strategic. Which brings us to the emotional heart of this chapter. Because this isn't about ambition. It's about perception. Hollywood is hypersensitive to perception. It notices when energy shifts. When someone's presence feels intentional rather than organic. And according to whispers, that's what began to unsettle people. Not the outreach itself, but the reason behind it. It felt like correction. Like course adjustment. Like someone trying to recalibrate their position. And recalibration is a private process. Doing it publicly draws attention to the imbalance. Now here's the part no one says out loud. Hollywood doesn't punish failure. It punishes uncertainty. If people don't know how to place you anymore, they step back. And Meghan's place, socially, not publicly, had become unclear. Was she an insider? An observer? A figure passing through? No one knew. And when no one knows, they choose distance. This is also where the emotional toll deepens. Because exclusion doesn't just affect access. It affects identity. Especially for someone whose narrative has been shaped by belonging, and then not belonging, repeatedly. The pain compounds. And pain influences behavior. Which leads us to the next pivotal move. Because while public-facing strategies were unfolding, something else was happening quietly. A conversation. Not with a host. Not with a peer. But with someone positioned higher in the informal hierarchy. Someone whose opinion could clarify everything. Someone who could confirm whether this silence was temporary or permanent. And this is where the story tightens. Because that conversation, according to whispers, didn't go the way Meghan's camp hoped. Not because it was hostile, but because it was neutral. And neutrality, in this context, was devastating. No reassurance. No advocacy. No, this will pass. Just an unspoken acknowledgement. The silence wasn't accidental. It was informational. And once that realization set in, the strategy had to change. Because you can't fix a social shift from the outside. You either adapt or you double down. And this is where the risk escalates. Because doubling down means visibility. And visibility invites scrutiny. Which brings us to the moment that redefined everything. Because the next move, the one designed to reassert relevance, didn't just signal ambition. It signaled urgency. And urgency is the one thing Hollywood notices immediately. But not in a good way. Because urgency suggests loss of control. And once that perception takes hold, every action is interpreted through that lens. Even innocent ones. Which is why what Meghan allegedly did next, who she aligned with, where she appeared, and how it was framed, became a turning point. Not because it was wrong, but because it confirmed what many had quietly suspected, that the silence had landed, and that she was trying to outrun it. But in Hollywood, silence isn't something you outrun. It's something you absorb, or it absorbs you. It's about what happens when someone tries to reclaim power through visibility and inadvertently reveals how much they've lost. And when that happens, the consequences don't stay social. Hollywood remembers everything, even the things you think it forgot, especially the things you wish it would. That's where Chapter 7 begins, with memory. Not the public kind, the quiet kind. The kind that lives in private conversations, raised eyebrows, and sentences that trail off before names are spoken. Because while Meghan was allegedly trying to recalibrate her position through visibility, Hollywood was doing something else entirely. It was remembering. And memory, in this town, is never neutral. Let me ask you something. Have you ever noticed how some people never fully recover their footing once a certain story attaches to them, even when the headlines fade? That's not coincidence. That's pattern recognition. Hollywood doesn't operate on forgiveness. It operates on precedent. And precedent, once established, doesn't disappear. It just waits. This chapter is about the past, not in a tabloid sense, but in an experiential one. Because when people decide whether someone belongs in their private rooms, they don't just ask, "Who are you now?" They ask, "What happened last time?" And that question carries more weight than any public rebrand. According to industry whispers, as Meghan's name continued to circulate quietly, not as a scandal, but as a consideration, certain memories began resurfacing. Not accusations. Experiences. Moments where things felt complicated afterward. Moments where intentions were unclear. Moments where narratives shifted once the room emptied. Again, none of this requires wrongdoing. It requires discomfort. And discomfort sticks. What's important here is how these memories allegedly surfaced. Not as gossip, not as warnings, but as context. Someone would say, "Remember when?" Someone else would nod. The conversation would move on. No conclusions drawn. But the implication lingered. And once implication enters the room, the invitation quietly leaves. This is how reputations actually change. Not through exposés, through accumulation. Now let's talk about comparison, because this is where things get revealing. According to whispers, more than one person quietly compared Meghan's situation to another celebrity's trajectory. Someone who was once everywhere. Welcomed widely, invited enthusiastically, until they weren't. Not because of a single scandal, but because people began to feel uneasy, watched, misunderstood, pulled into narratives they didn't consent to. And once that comparison surfaced, even casually, it reframed everything. Because Hollywood is deeply allergic to repeating mistakes. If a situation feels familiar, people retreat. And Meghan's situation, for some, felt familiar in a way they didn't like. This is where Chapter 7 deepens emotionally. Because this isn't about one person's intent. It's about collective memory. And collective memory is powerful. It doesn't require consensus. It doesn't require proof. It requires shared feeling. And that feeling, according to whispers, was caution. Let's pause and examine something uncomfortable. Hollywood is full of deeply flawed people. People with scandals. People with reputations far worse than complicated. And yet, many of them remain socially embraced. Why? Because they're predictable. Their flaws are known. Their behavior is expected. Their presence doesn't create uncertainty. Uncertainty is worse than scandal. Because scandal can be managed. Uncertainty cannot. And Meghan, in Hollywood's private calculus, had become uncertain. Not because she's dangerous, but because people don't know how to place her. Is she an insider? An outsider? A critic? A participant? The ambiguity is the problem. Now here's where Demi's role echoes again. Because Demi's boundary wasn't interpreted as dramatic. It was interpreted as wise. And wisdom travels fast in this town. Once people started quietly agreeing that Demi's decision made sense, the frame shifted. This wasn't exclusion. It was discernment. And discernment is respected. So when other hosts considered their own gatherings, their own spaces, their own